Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here to give you the strategic insight you need, cutting right through the noise. Today, we're diving into a really big debate, one that's swirling around Australia's defense establishment right now. It's about spending. When we talk national security spending, what are we actually measuring? Is it just about hitting some politically nice number like, percentage of GDP? Or should the focus be squarely on usable military capability? What can the forces actually do?
That tension is absolutely key. It really is. And it's why, observers often say Australian defense planning has been tripped up for decades by this kind of inversion of logic. We should be deciding the strategy first, figuring out what capabilities that strategy needs.
And then work out the budget. Strategy versus budget.
Exactly. But historically, it's often been the other way around, hasn't it?
Budget drives strategy.
Precisely. It's like deciding you'll spend exactly, say, 2% of your income on a house without knowing if that gets you a tent or a mansion.
Right. And in today's world, maybe you suddenly need that mansion, or at least something much more robust. So today we're digging into the sources, looking at these recent, pretty ambitious policy shifts coming out of Canberra. And we'll examine this powerful, maybe even provocative argument for getting beyond just GDP percentages, our mission, to figure out what actually builds usable military power for you in this rapidly changing Indo-Pacific. Let's get into this transformation.
Okay. To really grasp the scale of the pivot happening now, you have to look back a bit, understand the legacy they're trying to break from. For years, Australia operated under the Defence of Australia doctrine. It's really a Cold War hangover. And this doctrine, it rested on two assumptions. Comfortable assumptions, maybe, but increasingly shaky ones.
Okay, what were they?
First, a real focus on continental defense, protecting the mainland, the immediate sea and air approaches. And second, this crucial belief in having a decade, 10 years, of warning time before any major threat materialized.
A decade warning time. Wow.
Yeah. It meant the government felt it could, put off spending on the really complex, expensive stuff, the long lead capabilities. The assumption was allies, particularly the U.S., would handle the big, distant, high-end fights.
That 10-year warning sounds like a massive fiscal cheat code almost. It let them postpone the really tough political decisions, the big investments, kept the budget looking deep. But, that sounds incredibly risky given everything we see happening globally now.
Oh, it was risky. And when geopolitics speeds up, like it really has since around 2016, that doctrine just left the ADF, the Australian Defence Force, often underprepared for rapid responses or for those major high-end strategic shifts.
Which brings us right up to that big strategic shift since 2020. The sources really paint a picture of growing recognition in Canberra, this acute strategic uncertainty in the region. They're recalibrating, moving away from waiting for threats towards deterrence, resilience, being ready for high-end conflict, basically now.
Yes, and that urgency really got formalized in 2020. You had the Defense Strategic Update, the DSU, and then the Force Structure Plan. This was the first major signal of commitment to change things. A huge number floated. $270 billion projected investment over the decade.
$270 billion.
Yes.
That definitely signaled they were serious. So what capabilities suddenly jumped to the top of the list to justify that kind of spending?
The focus shifted immediately to things that allow for power projection, for deterrence. So long-range strike capabilities, think missiles, long-range weapons, enhanced maritime security, much more focus there. Cyber and information warfare, naturally. And then, of course, the huge one, the move towards conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines under AUKUS.
Right. The need to operate further out, deter challenges before they even get close.
Exactly. They recognized they needed reach.
Okay, but here's where it gets messy, right? Because just throwing huge sums of money at a system, especially one maybe not ready to absorb it, that creates turbulence. What were the immediate effects, the practical consequences of that big 2020 policy shift?
Well, you saw this intense winners and losers dynamic play out almost instantly within Australia's defense industry. Some sectors, like those linked to cyber or the new long-range fires, they got a real boost, a boon. But others, particularly those tied to older platforms, legacy programs, they faced really painful uncertainty. Contracts questioned, sometimes canceled.
Chaos, essentially.
Yeah, it created instability. And that was compounded because the initial spending push, it often led to higher unit costs, delays. So the taxpayer ends up paying more, but actually getting fewer platforms delivered, at least initially.
Okay, so if $270 billion was committed in 2020, but the result was instability and higher costs, that suggests the first attempt to fix things maybe had its own structural issues, which leads us straight to 2024. The government releases the new National Defense Strategy, the NDS, and the Integrated Investment Program, the IIP. And they framed this new NDS as, what, a clearer, priority-driven plan for surviving in a much less certain world.
What's really telling here is that the 2024 plan kind of admits the 2020 process wasn't quite right. They literally called this new integrated investment program a complete rebuild. And to get the posture aligned with this new strategy, they had to reprioritize, basically move a massive AU $22.5 billion over just 4 years and an incredible AU $72.8 billion over the decade.
$72.8 billion being shifted around. That's not just tweaking the plan. That sounds like major surgery on what they decided just a few years earlier.
Yeah.
What got cut? What had to be sacrificed to free up that kind of money?
Well, they cut programs that were seen as, well, less essential for that immediate priority, deterrence and high-end warfighting. Things like shortening the service life of some older platforms, maybe delaying certain maintenance cycles, really focusing almost exclusively on capabilities they thought could be fielded quickly and credibly.
And the stated goal was finally aligning posture with strategy. What does that actually look like, on the ground?
It means focusing on the stuff that's not very glamorous, but is absolutely essential. Things like upgrading critical infrastructure, especially in the north, building up supply chain resilience, a huge lesson from recent years, and achieving what they call smoothing the pathway from concept to capability.
Right, cutting the red tape that slows things down.
Exactly, killing the bureaucracy, making sure that good ideas from R&D actually get from the lab bench into a usable piece of kit in the field fast.
Okay. But despite all these huge dollar figures, these strategic pivots, the political fight keeps coming back to that simple number, doesn't it? The GDP benchmark. Australia's historically been around 2% of GDP, that figure NATO champions.
And the current government has flagged a gradual rise, maybe towards 2.3 to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. But the critics are lining up. They're saying this is just dangerously slow, dangerously inadequate.
Why so vehement? Why isn't 2.5% enough in their eyes?
They point to the sheer speed of military modernization happening elsewhere in the region, particularly China, and they point to the reality of ongoing gray zone coercion.
Can you just quickly remind us what gray zone coercion means?
Sure, it's basically aggressive actions that deliberately stay below the threshold of actual shooting war. Think economic pressure, cyber attacks, using Coast Guard or maritime militia vessels constantly to push claims, intimidate neighbors. These actions steadily erode the status quo, they shift the strategic reality, all without firing a shot in anger. So critics argue, to push back against that and deter worse, Australia needs to move much more decisively, towards 3%, maybe even more, to have genuine independent deterrence.
Right. So here's the really high-stakes issue for you, the listener. If these political fiscal ceilings dictate the budget, if the government decides, look, we can only really sell 2.5% politically, then the strategy inevitably suffers. The risk is huge. You get persistent capability gaps, the industrial base stays fragile, and Australia misses this chance to really embed defense investment into the broader economy, driving innovation and resilience.
And that failure, that potential disconnect between the money spent and the actual capability delivered, that brings us to this really compelling counterargument. It's articulated brilliantly by a retired Royal Australian Navy captain, Nick Tate.
Yes, he wrote that piece. Forget the GDP ratio. Our objective is a force that can sustain a fight. That title alone says a lot. Why does he argue that? What's the core idea?
Tate's central point is basically this: measuring defense spending just as a share of GDP. It's simple, sure, comparatively easy, but it's strategically lazy. He calls it a poor guide to whether the country can sustain and win a fight.
So what's his alternative?
His solution is kind of an inversion of the inversion we talked about earlier. He says Australia must design its military posture entirely around capability, around building a force that can actually stay in the fight. Get that right, he argues, and the GDP figure. It will then fall out of that. It becomes an output, not an input.
Stop starting with the cost. Start with the required performance. Makes sense. And Tate really emphasizes the stuff that, let's be honest, rarely makes headlines or gets debated in Parliament. The unglamorous, but utterly essential bits. Logistics, sustainment. We're not just talking buying the latest fighter jet, the F-35. We're talking about everything needed to keep it flying, mission after mission.
Exactly that. Real, usable military power isn't just the shiny platform. It depends fundamentally on fuel reserves, deployable command systems, hardened bases that can survive an attack, specialized repair yards. You could afford the world's fastest, most advanced sports car.
Right.
But if you forget you need special fuel, specialist mechanics, and maybe even a reinforced garage to keep it safe, well, the car itself isn't much use beyond looking good.
I remember reading John Coyne making a similar point in one of our sources. He said logistics and economic enablers are what actually turn defense spending into real military power. And the Ghost Shark program, that's a pretty stark example of this potential problem, isn't it?
It really is. Look, Ghost Shark is vital. It's a $1.7 billion investment in autonomous underwater vessels. This is the future, right? It's the cutting-edge hardware. But despite that huge commitment, there's still apparently a lack of clarity around the critical support infrastructure.
Like what?
Like secure basing for these things,
Yeah.
shore power hookups, specialized weapons handling facilities. These aren't standard torpedoes.
Yeah.
Maintenance depots designed for autonomous systems.
So you've bought the high-tech asset, but its ability to actually operate consistently, reliably, is potentially hampered because the basic support isn't fully fleshed out yet.
That's the risk. That's the operational challenge in a nutshell. Tate argues that this drive for minimum viable capability, just getting the platform itself, often becomes a trap. It means you focus all the energy and budget on the main item, and the critical enablers, the logistics, the support, they slip down the priority list. And you end up with a force that might look strong on paper, but is actually quite brittle in a real prolonged conflict.
That is a phenomenal point, a real strategic challenge. Tate had that killer line, arguing that basing defense policy around a GDP percentage might score political points, but the percentage itself won't refuel a Hornet at Tyndall or open a wharf in Darwin.
Yeah, that line hits hard, doesn't it? Because it grounds the whole debate in practical geographical reality. Tyndall, Darwin, these are critical bases in the Northern Territory, absolutely vital. If those bases lack the hardened shelters, the fuel reserves, the munitions storage, the whole defense posture for the North becomes incredibly fragile, regardless of what the GDP percentage is.
So he wants the government and the public debate, really, to shift focus away from abstract percentages towards measurable operational stuff. He asks questions like, how many days of fuel do we actually have stored securely in northern bases? How fast can we actually resupply and reload missile stocks? If we send a battle group out, how quickly and sustainably can we keep it supplied, keep it in the fight?
Exactly. His bottom line for Canberra is pretty blunt, pretty uncompromising. We should spend what's needed, not what looks neat. Focus on the usable power, the actual ability to sustain operations, and the GDP ratio. It'll sort itself out. And, let's be realistic, it will likely land well above where the current political comfort zone seems to be.
Okay, so let's pull back, look at the whole picture here. The fundamental challenge for Canberra seems to be navigating this really difficult path. On one hand, you've got external expectations, pressure from allies like the U.S. to spend more, carry more of the burden. And on the other, you have domestic realities, fiscal limits, political priorities, what the public is willing to support.
And that brings us right back to the core lesson, I think, for you listening. Strategy has to dictate the price tag, even if that price tag is higher than the political system finds comfortable. The uncomfortable truth, really, is that credible deterrence in this day and age, it costs a lot. And if the debate stays stuck purely on GDP percentages, you risk having these big, impressive-sounding numbers dominate the political talk.
Yeah, big numbers that sound good.
But without actually matching the real strategic need for capability, or even real clarity on what the strategy is.
So you end up maybe winning the political argument about spending enough, but potentially creating a strategic vulnerability because it's not the right kind of spending.
Precisely. So the ultimate question for Australia moving forward is, can it actually move past these external benchmarks? You know, NATO's 2%, or the domestic political calls for 3 or 3.5%. Can it finally develop its own unique criteria for what constitutes sufficient defense spending? Criteria truly grounded in the tangible reality of its own operational needs, its unique strategic geography. That really is the only way to finally break that cycle of budget-driving strategy once and for all.